Imagine yourself in hot, arid land with rivers lined by date palms and mountains looming on the horizon. The time is 5,000 years ago. The place is Mesopotamia. You might see groups of figures on the horizon trudging their dusty way towards a new place to live, the city of Uruk. You would be in the midst of one of the most important changes in how people lived, one that's often called the urban revolution. It's an exciting time in human history because people are inventing a new way of living and working together in close companionship here and in neighboring lands. New forms of art and architecture are being developed, like temples called ziggurats and stone reliefs called stela, which communicate information to larger numbers of people. The most radical innovation of the time is probably writing. For instance, this example of a Sumerian tablet from around 3000 BC shows pictographs which later developed into cuneiform. It's about buying real estate. This is a tablet that was used for teaching students to write. It has fully developed cuneiform. So, writing allows people to tag ownership of goods and land. Its use allows new social systems of administration and more complex trade. Writing also influences what kind of art is made. It changes the rules of the game. Along with the development of writing, we see the development of a new type of art, one that tells us an important story. We'll examine this new type of art in this lecture by looking at one of its greatest examples. The art developed during this period in the 4th millennium BC, called the Uruk period, and it set the stage for everything that came after in Western or European art historical traditions. Symbols that we take for granted now had to be invented back then, like headgear that identifies a figure as god or king. And unlike the cave art that we looked at in the last lecture about Chauvet, we have actual texts and literature for the first time that go a long way in helping us understand much more about what is being expressed in the art. The most important Mesopotamian art-related invention is a new form of narrative art, art that tells a coherent story in stone. In this lecture, I'm going to show you one of the earliest and most important objects created in Mesopotamia. It's called the Uruk Vase, and it was carved into a large offering vessel made of precious alabaster in the city of Uruk. Uruk was located in the land of Sumer, on the Euphrates River in southern Mesopotamia. Originally, it was the center for a very important religious cult, one that developed surrounding the Sumerian goddess of fertility and abundance. Uruk was the largest city in the world at its time and gave its name to a period called the Uruk and the Late Uruk period, which was approximately 3500 to 3000 BC. In the Bible, Uruk is mentioned and known as Erech. There's even a modern town there today called Warka. It's been inhabited for over 5,000 years. Uruk has a claim, not only perhaps having the earliest art of an urban center, but also the earliest literature, maybe. Gilgamesh, the famed legendary king of the Epic of Gilgamesh, was said to be ruler of the city. He supposedly built its famous walls for defense in a land that was and still is prone to conflict because of scarce resources like water. The famous vase from Uruk tells us a story, not only about the supremely important goddess named Inanna and her worshippers, but much more. It shows us in successive registers or bands that wrap around the vase the story of the land in which it was made. It tells us about the development of an actual society which gave birth to it. It shows a human narrative, a ritual, perhaps even a sacred marriage enacted between a ruler and a priestess or goddess. And this is the only vase of this type that has survived down to the present time. And as this was created at a very exciting time, at the dawn of urban civilization, this vase is one of the most important works for understanding human ideas, for rituals and artistry of the time. The story on the vase is put into the context of some of humanity's most basic and important technological developments in the last few thousand years. Farming, animal husbandry, irrigation, and nucleation of population are all represented in this artwork. So let's look at the vase and unfurl the story. This large cult vase, 1.05 meters in height, was found in an Uruk temple hoard in a precinct that was dedicated to the fertility goddess Inanna. She was the most important deity in the city of Uruk. The vase, which is conical in shape and has a flared foot, probably dates to around 3100 to 3000 BC. We can't give you an exact date because carved stone can't usually be dated. You can get only the date the stone was created geologically and see whether the tools used to carve something were ancient or modern by looking through a microscope at the carved areas. You may have seen the vase in the news after the U.S. entered Iraq. It was looted from the Iraq Museum in 2003. The Iraqis who took it realized only afterwards that it had great significance and was a cultural masterpiece. So they returned the vase, loading it into the trunk of their car and driving to the museum during an amnesty period to return such objects. The director of the museum, Donnie George, had a truck drive up behind it to block it in so they wouldn't leave with it again. The vase was returned, broken into pieces, but many of them were breaks that had already occurred and been repaired, some in ancient times. It was that valuable. The vase depicts a narrative of the foundation of a civilization, and there are more specific ritual scenes at the very top. All of these scenes are carved in shallow relief into 5 separate registers that circle the alabaster vessel. The vase reflects a hierarchically ordered worldview, with the main scene at the top showing the ritual presentation of gifts to the love and fertility goddess Inanna, most likely by the now missing ruler figure. What can it tell us? Let's look at it closely. The story starts on the very bottom register. 2 undulating lines at the very bottom indicate rippling water, a scarce commodity in Mesopotamia, and one upon which everything else depended. After all, it was here in the land of Sumer that irrigation was developed into a very sophisticated technology. In fact, these rather abstract lines seem to represent the river itself. We also know that similar wavy lines on other pots and stone reliefs represent water in the same way with wavy or zigzag lines. Above the water, 2 kinds of vegetation grow from a straight line representing the land. These alternating plants are the grains grown by these early farmers, most importantly, probably barley. This register then represents the flora, the agriculture that ultimately supports the community. Above the flora is the fauna, a register or line of sheep, alternating ewes and rams, females and males. These animals form the basis of the temple herds and the wealth of the community. The fact that the 2 sexes alternate reflects reproduction. Now, remember that domestication of animals and the various uses to which they were put was still a newer or evolving technology. Sheep were important not just for meat and milk, but also for the wool they produced and the resulting textile industry, which produced the commodity of woolen cloth for trade. Sheep and goats were among the earliest animals domesticated, probably sometime around 10,000 or so years ago. In the larger middle register, above the animals, are nude humans who are walking in the opposite direction from the animals. They're quite possibly priests, all similar naked, plump, and bald men who bear gifts of produce, probably fruit from the land, in varying kinds of containers, baskets, or pots. Their nakedness symbolizes their humility as they approach the goddess. They also form a sort of rhythmic procession in opposition to the animals below. At the very top of the vase is the largest and most important scene. A large figure of a woman, clothed in a long dress, is being offered one of these conical baskets or pots of produce by a smaller naked priest who faces her. This woman is the goddess Inanna, or the priestess who represents her. We know this because behind her are two bundled reed gateposts with streamers, which are recognized to be her symbols from written texts of the time. Inanna's headgear has been broken off in antiquity, so we cannot be sure that she wore the divine horns that would have identified her as a goddess. Behind the presenting priest is the priest ruler, though unfortunately his figure is very damaged. He wears a net skirt, which we know is confined to representing the ruler figures of the time. Let me show you what he might have looked like. We actually have an unbroken image of such a ruler, which we can see in a cylinder seal impression from the same period, the Uruk period. Here, you can see that the ruler figure is a man wearing a net skirt and holding a sheaf of wheat. He's at the right, approaching two large vases, which look just like the Uruk vase itself. At the left of the vases is a woman, probably a priestess of Inanna. You can tell that Inanna is referenced here. Why? Because we see the curled post, which is her sign. So this seal is showing us the same scene, much more simplified, that we're looking at carved on the Uruk vase. In the image on the Uruk vase, the goddess, in essence, receives her bridegroom at the door of her temple dwelling. They are about to enact the rites of the sacred marriage ceremony, it seems. These figures form the center of a complex scene, one which tells us even more about the vase and Sumerian society when we read it further. So, what else does this upper register include? Behind the goddess or priestess are the two poles with rings and streamers. They represent the reed posts, which stood at the doorways to the temples of Inanna. If we then enter the temple door, to the right we find a large ram, similar to the ones illustrated below, except that he has two objects sitting on his back. They're the figure of a man standing on a platform, and slightly below, one of a woman standing on a platform. The reed post is repeated in slightly smaller form behind this ram, as if to emphasize Inanna's presence in a visual way. We see more offering or cultic gifts behind the ram. There are two large pots of produce, similar to the ones the naked men carry. Then there are two figures of animals, a goat and a lion, which would actually seem to be vessels in those forms, since each has a spout on its back And most fascinatingly, we see two vases which look just like smaller versions of the vase itself. This makes the whole scene into a sort of self-referential image. They're actually showing the object on which they're working in its own proper setting. We don't know exactly what the other figures represent, unfortunately. Now, it's believed that the priest-ruler in this ritual, who, according to some theories, represents the male vegetation god Dumuzi or Tammuz, is uniting with the fertility goddess Inanna, most likely in the rite that is called the sacred marriage in later times. Perhaps this anticipated consummation is meant metaphorically, but many scholars believe that the two figures actually engaged in a sexual union. This might have served the ruler well in terms of legitimizing his lineage. He could claim that his union with the goddess produced a semi-divine heir. We don't know for sure, but the emphasis on alternating male and female elements in rhythmic repetition and on elements of sustenance seem to point to a cyclical renewal in a rite which is meant to ensure the fertility of the land. The vase thus holds the key to understanding much of the art and worldview of the Sumerians of Mesopotamia. It shows the role of the priest-king, making offerings to the goddess, and the emphasis on the fertility of the earth. These rites, shown here, assure provisions for the population and the temple complexes. This is a complicated and sophisticated work of art. It encompasses the seasonal cyclicality of the land, the dependence of humans on flora and fauna to survive, and ultimately, humans' dependence on the largesse of a divinity who provides for their sustenance. The Uruk Vase is a remarkable and unique object that presents us with an ordered and hierarchical world as seen by one of the earliest complex societies on Earth. Each realm is represented, the water, vegetable, animal, and human realm to the temple household, the goddess or priestess, and the king himself. In addition, their functions and ritual activities are also implied by the scenes. Are there other artworks which shed more light on the Uruk Vase and the society that produced it? Yes. Let's look briefly at one. We've seen how important the fertility goddess Inanna was at Uruk. We don't have many large-scale sculptures from this period of time in the ancient Near East, but there is one fragmentary head that could help us imagine what Inanna or another female deity might have looked like. Although we can't be sure that it was Inanna herself, here is one of the masterpieces of the age. It helps us imagine how the goddess on the Uruk Vase might have looked in a sculpture of the time. This life-size stone head of a woman was also found in the temple precinct of the goddess Inanna at Uruk, just like the Uruk Vase. It dates to sometime before 3000 BC. It's also made of alabaster, a precious commodity in Mesopotamia, a place which had plenty of sand, but not a lot of stone. This mask-like limestone carving of a woman's face is missing some important parts. It's thought to have had an attached wig of another material, possibly gold or other metal. The stone and the metal were luxury goods that had to be imported, and their use shows some of the wealth and prestige that the temple commanded. In fact, Mesopotamia, partly out of necessity, had a tradition of making what we call composite sculptures. Unlike the later Greek tradition, which preferred carving a face or figure out of one piece of stone, Mesopotamians like to use different materials, usually precious or colorful, like gold, shell, carnelian, or lapis lazuli. Many of these materials were imported from far away. We'll see more examples of these composite sculptures in the following 2 lectures. They reflect the lively imagination and resourcefulness of the sculptors who lived in a harsh land. Now let's look closely at the face of the Uruk head. If you look at the mouth and chin area, you can see they're carved with extraordinary sensitivity and naturalism, in contrast to the eyes and eyebrows. Those features were inlaid with some semi-precious stone that is now missing. It was something of a contrast in color, and if we look at other contemporary objects, lapis lazuli or shell may have been the missing elements. Lapis, it's important to note, came all the way from Afghanistan, which was a very long trek indeed from Mesopotamia. This necklace is of lapis. Lapis was rare and highly valued. It had a deep blue color and could be polished to a lustrous finish. Its use in other objects at this time shows that the trade routes of this ancient era were really quite far-reaching, and there was considerable wealth in the region. We can also infer from the use of lapis or the use of any other such expensive material that this was an object to be venerated or regarded with awe and respect. Many scholars believe that this head may depict the goddess Inanna herself, although we have no proof of that. But its find spot, the exact spot where it was excavated in the temple of Inanna, it gives us some evidence that makes it more likely. It's unique, and it can give us an idea of how important the female deity could be. In the thousands of years before the Uruk urban revolution, female figurines, usually small, had been used in some sort of domestic cult of fertility and were found all over the ancient Mediterranean. This head is a stark contrast to those anonymous and single-purpose objects. It is perhaps our very first rendering of particular and unique features. The mouth and the cheeks are so sensitively modeled that it looks like it could be a likeness of an actual person, not a general idea of a woman. It marks a break with the tradition of mass fertility figures and the lack of personality or facial features that are found on those utilitarian objects. The Uruk head is also significant because of 2 features besides this. We see 2 hallmarks of Mesopotamian art from the very beginning of its fluorescence. One is the use of several different kinds of materials in one statue or art object, which I already mentioned. The other is the connected eyebrows, which my students love to call the unibrow. The heavy eyebrows sometimes are rendered in a herringbone pattern, and they occur again and again on all sorts of human figures from Mesopotamia. Going back to the Uruk vase, you can see something else that is interesting in the development of ancient art. Sculpture, whether small or life-size, cannot convey the amount of information that scenes carved in relief can impart. So, if you're an artist or person who is commissioning an artist, like a ruler, and you want to get a complex message across about religion, your rule, and so forth, you can fit a lot more onto a carved relief sculpture than on a 3-dimensional one. In Mesopotamia, these reliefs are usually divided into registers, just like the ones we saw on the Uruk vase. The long rollout of a story, which we usually read from left to right, also gives us the narrative movement which we crave as humans. A story is told, but it's not always a specific one, like a documentation of an actual specific event. It could be representation of a ritual which was recurring, like the worship of Inanna or the sacred marriage. Think back to the invention and use of the tiny cylinder seal at about the same time or a little earlier than the Uruk head. You can see in miniature how a story or motif can be rolled out on clay. This is similar to how a comic book works, and to what we see much later in reading the stone reliefs of Assyria. The invention of the cylinder seal, which could be rolled out to any length on clay, showed us the importance of the repetitive and rhythmic to the Mesopotamians. It also becomes a part of the Mesopotamian artistic convention. It may be hard to imagine today, but forms of art had to be invented at this very early age. And in this lecture, you've seen two forms that are characteristic of the Mesopotamian culture. One, composite sculpture, and two, the use of registers in relief sculpture. Some of these conventions are so good that they stay in use for thousands of years, in fact. We'll see them again and again in our next few lectures. Our next lecture, in fact, is about a unique and enigmatic object which uses both. It shows the rollout of a story, an idea similar to what we have looked at just now. This unique object, whose purpose we have never been able to pin down definitively, is the famous royal standard of Ur, which is from a nearby city in Mesopotamia, Ur, but many centuries later. Found in a tomb in the fabled royal cemetery at Ur, it's one of the most important and interesting objects from the ancient Mesopotamian city. It will provide us with even more tantalizing clues as to the nature and activities of the long-lost Sumerian people.